The morning sun cast long shadows across Silverbrook's dusty main street as church bells rang out over the small frontier town. It was Saturday, September 14th, 1878, and the whole community had gathered for what promised to be the social event of the season. The wedding of Thomas McKenna, the town's beloved blacksmith, to a mysterious woman from back east. Margaret Rose O'Sullivan stepped carefully down from the stagecoach, her left leg dragging slightly behind her right. The ivory silk dress she wore was beautiful, imported all the way from Boston, but it couldn't hide the pronounced limp that marked each step she took toward the small wooden church. Her auburn hair was pinned beneath a delicate lace veil, and her green eyes held a mixture of hope and apprehension as she surveyed her new home. "Well, I'll be," whispered Mrs. Henderson, the general store owner's wife, nudging her companion. Tom didn't mention she was afflicted. The whispers started small, like a prairie wind gathering strength. They spread from the church steps to the hitching posts, from the saloon doors to the barber shop window. By the time Margaret had reached the church entrance, half the town was buzzing with hushed conversations about poor Tom and his damaged bride. "Bless her heart," said Martha Wells, the schoolteacher, though her tone carried more pity than blessing. "What's a man like Thomas thinking, taking on such a burden?" Sheriff Jake Morrison stood near the church entrance, his weathered face showing no judgment, only the quiet respect he showed all folks. At 35, he'd seen enough of life's hardships to know that a person's worth wasn't measured by their stride. His keen blue eyes noticed something others missed: the way Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her right hip when she felt threatened, and the calculating way she assessed every face in the crowd. Inside the church, Thomas McKenna waited at the altar, his broad shoulders tense with anxiety. He'd received Margaret's letters for 6 months, each one revealing an intelligent, spirited woman who'd survived the death of her parents in an Indian raid and made her way alone in the world. Her limp, mentioned only briefly in correspondence, mattered little to a man who'd learned to value character over appearances. As Margaret began her slow walk down the aisle, the church fell silent except for the scraping sound of her left foot against the wooden floor. Each step seemed to echo in the hushed space, amplified by the weight of judgment from every pew. Some faces showed genuine sympathy, others barely concealed amusement, and a few displayed outright disdain. "She's pretty enough," someone whispered from the back pews, "but that leg's gonna be trouble birthing children." Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, her fingers gripping her small bouquet of prairie flowers until her knuckles showed white beneath her gloves. But she kept walking, her chin raised with a dignity that seemed to grow stronger with each disapproving glance. Thomas stepped forward as she reached the altar, offering his arm with a gentle smile that spoke of genuine affection. "You look beautiful, Margaret," he said quietly, and for the first time since arriving in Silverbrook, she smiled. Reverend Phillips opened his worn Bible and began the ceremony, his voice carrying the familiar cadence of countless weddings. But even as the sacred words filled the air, the undercurrent of whispered judgment continued to flow through the congregation like an unwelcome river. As they exchanged vows, Margaret's voice was clear and strong, carrying the hint of an Irish accent that spoke of her Boston roots. Thomas's responses were equally firm, his calloused hands gentle as he placed a simple gold band on her finger. But the beauty of the moment was marred by the continuing murmur of commentary from the pews. Margaret could hear fragments. "Such a shame. Poor Tom doesn't know what he's gotten into. How's she gonna manage a household?" When Reverend Phillips pronounced them man and wife, Thomas kissed his new bride with tender respect. As they turned to face the congregation, Margaret's green eyes swept across the sea of faces, some genuinely happy for the couple, others marked with pity, curiosity, or subtle cruelty. Outside the church, as the newlyweds received congratulations and well wishes, the comments continued. Some were delivered with false kindness, others with brutal honesty. "Margaret, dear," said Mrs. Henderson, with a saccharine smile, "I do hope you'll be able to keep up with the demands of frontier life. It can be so challenging for someone with your condition." "I'm sure I'll manage just fine," Margaret replied evenly, though her grip on Thomas's arm tightened slightly. Old Pete Guthrie, never one to mince words, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and shook his head. "Tom, you could have had your pick of the Williams sisters or any number of able-bodied gals. What in tarnation possessed you to send for a crippled bride?" Thomas's face darkened with anger, but before he could respond, Margaret placed a restraining hand on his chest. "Mr. Guthrie," she said with icy politeness, "I may walk differently than others, but I assure you there's nothing wrong with my hearing or my memory. I'll remember your kindness." The old man shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze, mumbling something about just trying to be helpful before shuffling away. Sheriff Morrison approached the couple as the crowd began to disperse. "Mrs. McKenna," he said, tipping his hat respectfully, "welcome to Silverbrook. I hope you'll find our town to be more than it appears at first glance." Margaret studied his face carefully, noting the sincerity in his weathered features. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'm sure I will." So, as the sun began to set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Margaret and Thomas walked slowly toward their new home, a modest but well-built house on the edge of town. The sound of Margaret's uneven gait echoed off the wooden boardwalk, a reminder to all who heard it that Silverbrook now had a resident who didn't quite fit their idea of what a frontier wife should be. But as the newlyweds disappeared into their home, none of the townspeople could have imagined the truth about Margaret Rose O'Sullivan McKenna. Hidden beneath the folds of her wedding dress, carefully concealed in a custom holster, was a Colt .45 revolver, a weapon she knew how to use with deadly precision, learned during 3 harrowing years when survival depended on being faster and more accurate than the men who wanted her dead. The people of Silverbrook had judged their new neighbor by her limp. Soon, they would learn that sometimes the most dangerous individuals are those who appear the most vulnerable. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding, and Margaret McKenna was beginning to understand the true nature of her new home. Silverbrook was a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where reputations were built on small actions and destroyed by smaller mistakes. And in those 3 weeks she had become the subject of constant, albeit subtle, scrutiny. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and prairie grass as Margaret made her way down Main Street toward Henderson's general store. Her progress was slow but determined, her left leg dragging slightly with each step. The wooden boardwalk creaked under her weight, and she was acutely aware of how the sound seemed to announce her presence to everyone within earshot. "Morning, Mrs. McKenna," called out Dr. Harrison from his office doorway. He was one of the few townspeople who had shown her genuine kindness, perhaps because his medical training had taught him that physical limitations didn't define a person's worth. "Good morning, Doctor," Margaret replied with a warm smile. "How's your wife feeling?" "Much better since you brought over that herbal tea recipe. Sarah says it's the first thing that's helped her morning sickness in weeks." As Margaret continued toward the store, she noticed the familiar pattern of behavior her presence seemed to trigger. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people watched her pass, resuming in hushed tones once she was supposedly out of earshot. Children were quickly hushed when they pointed or asked innocent questions about the lady who walks funny. Mrs. Henderson looked up with forced cheer as Margaret entered the general store. "Why, Margaret, how are you settling in, dear?" "Very well, thank you." Margaret placed her shopping list on the counter, noting how the other customers, 2 ranch wives and a traveling merchant, fell silent to listen to the conversation. "I do hope you're not finding the work too strenuous," Mrs. Henderson continued while gathering the requested items. "Managing a household out here isn't like having servants back east, you know." "I've never had servants," Margaret replied mildly. "I've been taking care of myself for quite some time." One of the ranch wives, Emily Patterson, stepped forward with barely concealed curiosity. Margaret, dear, we're organizing the church social for next month. We'll need women who can help with the cooking and decorating. Do you think you'll be up for it?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implication. Margaret understood the subtext. Would her disability prevent her from contributing to community activities? "I'd be happy to help in whatever way I can," Margaret answered diplomatically. "I'm quite capable in the kitchen, and I have some experience with event planning." "Oh, how wonderful!" Emily exclaimed with exaggerated enthusiasm. "We'll just have to make sure you don't overexert yourself. Perhaps you could handle something simple, like arranging flowers or polishing silverware." Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Back in Boston, she had managed the household budget for a prominent family, organized charity fundraisers for the church, and once talked her way out of being robbed by 3 armed men. But here, her limp seemed to overshadow any other capabilities she might possess. As she left the store, arms full of supplies, Margaret noticed a group of children playing in the street. They stopped their game to watch her pass, whispering among themselves with the cruel innocence of youth. "My mama says she's hurt inside too," one little girl said to her friend. "That's why Mr. Tom had to send away for a wife instead of marrying someone from here. Papa says she's probably barren," added a boy of perhaps 8 years. "Says a woman with legs like that can't birth proper babies." And Margaret paused, her green eyes flashing with anger and pain. She started to turn toward the children, then stopped herself. They were only repeating what they heard at home, she reminded herself. The real judgment came from their parents. "Children," came a firm voice from behind her. Sheriff Morrison had appeared, his presence immediately commanding respect. "Don't you have chores waiting at home?" The children scattered like startled prairie dogs, and Morrison fell into step beside Margaret. His long stride automatically adjusted to match her slower pace, a kindness she noticed and appreciated. "Don't mind them," he said quietly. "Small towns can be challenging for anyone who's different." "Different?" Margaret repeated with a bitter laugh. "Is that what they call it?" "Among other things." Morrison's tone was dry but understanding. "Folks here are quick to judge and slow to change their minds. But they're not bad people mostly, just narrow in their thinking." They walked in companionable silence for a moment before Margaret spoke again. "Sheriff, may I ask you something?" "Of course. Why do you treat me differently than the others do? You don't seem to see my limp as a defining characteristic." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "I reckon I've seen enough of life to know that a person's exterior doesn't always match what's inside. Some of the most dangerous folks I've encountered looked harmless as lambs. And some of the finest people I've known carried scars you couldn't see." Margaret glanced at him sharply. "You sound like you speak from experience." "Don't we all?" He tipped his hat as they reached her house. "Have a good day, Mrs. McKenna." That evening, as Margaret prepared dinner in her new kitchen, she reflected on the day's interactions. Through the window, she could see Thomas in his forge, sparks flying as he worked the bellows. He had been nothing but kind and patient, never once making her feel inadequate or burdensome. But even his goodness couldn't shield her from the weight of community judgment. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Martha Wells, the school teacher, standing on her porch with a covered dish. "I brought you some apple pie," Martha said with a genuine smile. "I thought you might enjoy a taste of local cooking." "How thoughtful," Margaret replied, genuinely touched. "Won't you come in for coffee?" "Me." As they sat in Margaret's small but cozy parlor, Martha's demeanor was noticeably different from the other townswomen, more direct, less condescending. "I wanted to apologize," Martha said suddenly, "for what happened at the church, and for how some folks have been treating you since." Margaret set down her coffee cup carefully. "That's kind of you, but you weren't among those who—" "I was," Martha interrupted. "Maybe not with words, but with my silence. I stood by and let others say cruel things, and that makes me just as guilty." The honesty was refreshing, and Margaret found herself warming to this frank young woman. Why are you telling me this? Martha sighed, staring into her coffee. Because I know what it's like to be judged for things beyond your control. I'm 28 years old and unmarried, practically an old maid by frontier standards. People assume there's something wrong with me, that I'm too particular or too difficult. They don't consider that maybe I just haven't found the right person, or that I value my independence. And now they're judging me for my limp, Margaret said quietly. Among other things, there are rumors, about why you really left Boston, about your family, about whether you can fulfill your wifely duties. Martha's cheeks reddened slightly. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but I thought you should know what people are saying. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. What kinds of rumors? Some say you were thrown out of respectable society back east. Others think you're hiding some dark secret. A few of the meaner-spirited women suggest that Thomas was desperate enough to marry anyone, She stopped herself. Even a cripple, Margaret finished flatly. I don't believe any of it, Martha said quickly, but I thought you should be prepared. Small towns thrive on gossip, and right now you're the most interesting thing that's happened here in months. After Martha left, Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the last light fade from the western sky. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of the town settling in for the night, dogs barking, children being called inside, the faint music from the saloon. It was a peaceful scene, but she felt anything but peaceful. Thomas came in from the forge, his face and hands blackened with soot. "Good day?" he asked, kissing her cheek. "Enlightening," she replied, helping him wash up for dinner. As they sat down to eat, Thomas reached across the table to take her hand. "Margaret, I know things haven't been easy since you arrived. The people here, they mean well, but they see me as a burden you've taken on out of desperation," she finished for him. Thomas's grip tightened on her hand. "What they see doesn't matter. I see a strong, intelligent woman who's been through more than most people could imagine and come out stronger for it." Margaret smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Thomas, there are things about my past, about how I survived after my parents died, things that might shock you." "Then tell me," he said simply. "We're married now. We shouldn't have secrets between us." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. How could she explain that the delicate woman the townspeople pitied had once shot 3 men in self-defense? How could she tell him about the months she'd spent tracking the raiders who killed her family, or the skills she'd learned from a retired gunfighter who took pity on an orphaned girl? "Perhaps someday," she said finally, "when the time is right." That night, as Thomas slept beside her, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Hidden beneath the floorboards of their bedroom was a leather satchel containing her most precious possessions, her parents' wedding rings, her mother's letters, and the Colt .45 that had kept her alive during the darkest period of her life. She had come to Silverbrook hoping for a fresh start, a chance to be seen as something other than a victim or a survivor. But the townspeople's reactions made it clear that her limp would always define her in their eyes. They saw weakness where there was strength, fragility where there was steel. What they didn't know, what none of them suspected, was that Margaret Rose O'Sullivan McKenna was probably the most dangerous person in their quiet little town. And if circumstances ever required it, she would remind them all that the deadliest snakes often come with the most unassuming appearance. For now, she would continue to play the role they expected, the pitiable bride, struggling to adapt to frontier life. But beneath the surface, she remained alert and ready, her instincts honed by years of necessity. Because Margaret had learned a hard lesson during her years alone. Predators always target what they perceive as the weakest member of the herd, and sometimes the only way to survive was to prove them wrong in the most definitive way possible. The 3rd week of October brought an unseasonable warmth to Silverbrook, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath before winter's arrival. Margaret had settled into a routine of sorts, morning shopping trips where she endured the townspeople's mixture of pity and condescension, afternoons spent learning the rhythms of frontier housekeeping, and evenings with Thomas, who remained blissfully unaware of the daily indignities his wife faced. On this particular Thursday morning, the town seemed more subdued than usual. Margaret noticed it immediately as she made her way toward the general store, her uneven gait echoing off the wooden boardwalk. Conversations were quieter, people moved with more purpose, and there was an undercurrent of tension that made her instincts prickle with familiar warning. Sheriff Morrison stood outside his office, his hand resting casually on his gun belt as he scanned the horizon to the east. His weathered face bore the grim expression of a man who had received troubling news. "Sheriff?" Margaret paused beside him, noting the tight lines around his eyes. "Is everything all right?" Morrison glanced down at her, his expression softening slightly. "Nothing for you to worry about, Mrs. McKenna, just keeping an eye on things." But Margaret's trained senses picked up the subtle signs others missed, the way Morrison's shoulders were set for action, the careful positioning that gave him a clear view of all approaches to town, the slight bulge in his vest pocket that suggested extra ammunition. She had seen the same preparations in herself during the dangerous months after her parents' death. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "I may be new to Silverbrook, but I'm not new to trouble. What's coming?" Morrison studied her face for a long moment, as if seeing something there he hadn't noticed before. "How do you mean that, ma'am?" "I mean that you're positioned for a fight, you're carrying extra shells, and you've been watching the Eastern Road like you're expecting unwelcome visitors. In my experience, when lawmen act like that, it means danger is on its way." The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly. "And what experience would that be?" Before Margaret could answer, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. 4 riders crested the hill east of town, moving at a steady pace that suggested purpose rather than urgency. Even at a distance, something about their bearing made Margaret's blood run cold. "The Garrett gang," Morrison said grimly. "Got word they've been working their way west, hitting small towns. Seems they've decided to honor us with a visit." Margaret's right hand moved instinctively toward her hip, stopping just short of where her gun would normally rest. Old habits died hard, and her body remembered the weight of the weapon, even when it wasn't there. "You should get inside," Morrison continued, his attention focused on the approaching riders. "Send word to your husband, tell folks to stay off the street." But Margaret didn't move. Instead, she studied the 4 men as they drew closer, her keen eyes cataloguing details with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to assess threats quickly. The leader rode a black horse and carried himself with the arrogant confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through violence. The others flanked him in a formation that spoke of experience and coordination. "Mrs. McKenna," Morrison said more firmly, "you need to get somewhere safe." "Of course," Margaret replied, but her tone was distant, distracted. "Sheriff, how many deputies do you have?" "None. Budget only covers me." Margaret's jaw tightened. 1 lawman against 4 experienced outlaws, odds that would challenge even the most skilled gunfighter. "What about the townsmen? Are any of them handy with weapons?" Morrison gave her a sharp look. "Ma'am, you're asking mighty specific questions for someone who should be seeking shelter." Before Margaret could respond, the riders reached the main street. They moved with the casual insolence of men who had faced down many small-town sheriffs and found them wanting. The leader, a man with cold grey eyes and a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, raised his hand to signal a halt directly in front of the sheriff's office. "Sheriff," the scarred man called out, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of someone supremely confident in his position. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" "Garrett," Morrison replied evenly. "Didn't expect to see you this far west." "Oh, we're just passing through," Garrett said with a smile that held no warmth. "Thought we might stop in, rest our horses, maybe conduct a little business while we're here." Margaret noticed how the other 3 riders had positioned themselves to cover different angles of the street. They were preparing for trouble, and their movement suggested they'd done this many times before. Her right hand twitched again, muscle memory demanding action her mind hadn't yet authorized. "What kind of business?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The profitable kind," Garrett replied. "See, we've had a long, hard ride, and we're running a bit short on traveling funds. Figured a prosperous little town like this might be willing to help us out." "Town's not that prosperous," Morrison said carefully, "and folks here work hard for what they have." Garrett's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "Sheriff, I think you misunderstand. We're not asking for charity. We're simply going to help ourselves to whatever we need. The only question is whether you're going to make this difficult." Margaret felt her breathing change, becoming deeper and more controlled. It was an automatic response her body had learned during those terrible months when violence was a daily possibility. Around them, she noticed that the street was rapidly emptying as townspeople sensed the danger and sought shelter. "You boys, best move along," Morrison said, his hand now openly resting on his gun butt. "There's nothing for you here." "Oh, but there is," Garrett said, his eyes glittering with malicious amusement. "There's a bank, there's a general store, and I'll bet there are some fine homes with nice things in them. Plus, we heard tell there are some lovely ladies in this town. My boys and we appreciate lovely ladies." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Margaret felt something cold and deadly settle in her chest. She had heard such threats before, from the men who murdered her parents. The memory of that day, the screams, the gunfire, the smell of smoke and blood, crashed over her with startling clarity. "Last warning," Morrison said, his voice steady despite the odds stacked against him. "Move along or face the consequences." Garrett's three companions spread out slightly, hands moving to their weapons. The leader's scarred face twisted into a cruel grin. "Sheriff, I admire your dedication, but let's be realistic here. You're one man against four. Even if you're fast, and you'd have to be mighty fast, you can't get us all." Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that Morrison was about to die. He was brave and capable, but he was also outnumbered and outgunned, and after he fell, the gang would have free rein in the town. They would rob and terrorize, and quite possibly kill innocent people. People like Martha Wells, who had shown her kindness, like Dr. Harrison, who treated her with respect, like Thomas, who loved her despite the town's whispered judgments. Time seemed to slow as Margaret made her decision. Her right hand moved to her hip again, this time not stopping at empty air, but continuing to the hidden slit in her dress that concealed the holster Thomas had never noticed. The Colt .45 felt familiar and comforting in her grip as she drew it with practiced ease, the weight of it as natural as breathing. "Actually," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent street, "it's 4 against 2. Every head turned toward her in shock. Garrett's eyes widened as he took in the sight of the limping bride, standing with a gun held in a perfect two-handed grip, her stance solid, despite her physical limitations. "Well, I'll be damned," Garrett said, his voice filled with genuine surprise. "The crippled girl wants to play." "The crippled girl," Margaret replied coldly, "has played this game before, and won." Morrison shot her a look of alarm and admiration mixed together. "Mrs. McKenna, get back." "No," Margaret said firmly, her eyes never leaving Garrett's face. "I've spent weeks listening to this town treat me like a broken thing, something to be pitied and dismissed. But I am not broken, and I am not helpless, and I will not stand by and watch good people suffer when I have the ability to prevent it." Garrett studied her carefully, his experienced eye taking in her stance, her grip, the steady way she held the weapon. "Lady, you might have a gun, but do you have the sand to use it?" Margaret's smile was colder than a prairie winter. "Why don't you try me and find out?" For a moment, the street was frozen in tableau. 4 outlaws on horseback, a sheriff with his hand on his gun, and a woman in a blue dress holding a revolver, with the competence of someone who had used it to stay alive. Then Garrett made his choice. His hand flashed toward his gun, and the quiet morning exploded into violence. Margaret's first shot took Garrett in the chest before his weapon had cleared leather, the bullet striking him with enough force to knock him backward off his horse. Her second shot, fired with clockwork precision, caught the rider to Garrett's left in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. Morrison, reacting with the speed of an experienced lawman, drew and fired at the third rider, his bullet finding its mark center mass. The fourth outlaw, seeing three of his companions down in the space of heartbeats, threw his hands up in surrender, his face pale with shock. The gunfight had lasted perhaps 5 seconds. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay bleeding in the dust, and the fourth sat on his horse with his hands raised high, staring at Margaret as if she were some kind of supernatural apparition. Margaret kept her gun trained on the surviving outlaw, while Morrison secured his weapon and checked on the fallen. Garrett was dead, his grey eyes staring sightlessly at the morning sky. The man Margaret had wounded was alive but unconscious, and Morrison's target would need medical attention but would survive. As the immediate danger passed, Margaret became aware of faces appearing in windows and doorways. The townspeople who had hidden from the gunfight were now emerging to stare at the aftermath with expressions of shock and disbelief. "Jesus Christ," whispered old Pete Guthrie, his jaw hanging open. "Did you see that? She was faster than lightning." "Where did she learn to shoot like that?" asked Mrs. Henderson, her voice filled with awe. Dr. Harrison came running with his medical bag, stopping short when he saw Margaret still holding her gun. "Margaret, how did you—" Sheriff Morrison approached her carefully, his face showing a mixture of gratitude and stunned respect. "Mrs. McKenna, I don't know what to say. You saved my life, and probably the lives of half the people in this town." Margaret finally lowered her weapon, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "I did what had to be done," she said simply. "But how?" Morrison pressed. "Where did you learn to handle a gun like that?" Margaret looked around at the gathering crowd, at the faces filled with amazement, curiosity, and perhaps a touch of fear. The secret she had kept hidden was out now, exposed by necessity and circumstance. "It's a long story," she said quietly, "and not a particularly pleasant one." Thomas came running from his forge, his face white with panic. "Margaret, I heard gunshots." He stopped abruptly as he took in the scene, his wife holding a smoking revolver, bodies in the street, and Morrison standing beside her with clear admiration. "Margaret?" Thomas said, his voice filled with confusion. "What happened here?" Margaret met her husband's eyes, seeing the questions there, the sudden uncertainty about the woman he had married. "I'll explain everything," she promised. "But first, shouldn't we see to the wounded?" As Dr. Harrison began treating the injured outlaws and Morrison organized the townspeople to help clean up the aftermath, Margaret stood in the middle of Main Street, still holding the gun that had revealed her deepest secret. Around her, she could hear the whispered conversations of people trying to reconcile the helpless bride they thought they knew with the deadly competent woman who had just saved their town. The truth was out now. There would be no more hiding behind the facade of helpless femininity, no more allowing people to define her by her limitations. For better or worse, Silverbrook now knew that their limping bride was something far more complex and dangerous than they had ever imagined. And as Margaret finally holstered her weapon and walked toward her husband, she realized that for the first time since arriving in town, no one was looking at her limp. They were all too busy, staring at her in wonder, trying to understand how the woman they had dismissed and pitied had just proven herself to be their unlikely savior. The silence in the McKenna parlor was deafening. Thomas sat across from his wife, his calloused hands clasped tightly together as he tried to process what he had witnessed in the street. Outside, the sounds of normal life were slowly returning to Silverbrook. The injured outlaws had been moved to Dr. Harrison's clinic, the bodies removed, and the blood washed from the boardwalk. But inside this small room, everything had changed. Margaret stood by the window, still wearing the blue dress that now bore traces of gunpowder residue. The Colt. 45 lay on the table between them, no longer hidden but impossible to ignore. The weight of unspoken questions filled the air like smoke from a dying fire. 6 years, Thomas said finally, his voice rough with emotion. We've been writing to each other for 6 months, married for 3 weeks, and I'm just now learning that my wife is a gunfighter. I'm not a gunfighter, Margaret replied quietly, not turning from the window. I'm a survivor. Is there a difference? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching Sheriff Morrison across the street as he questioned the captured outlaw. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of painful memories. The difference is choice, Thomas. Gunfighters choose their path. They seek out violence, glory, reputation. I never wanted any of that. I just wanted to live. She turned from the window then, and Thomas saw tears in her green eyes for the first time since he'd known her. I suppose you deserve the whole truth now. Margaret moved slowly to her chair, her limp more pronounced than usual. The adrenaline of the gunfight had worn off, leaving her feeling drained and emotionally exposed. She had managed to keep her secrets for 3 weeks, but now there was nowhere left to hide. My parents weren't killed in an Indian raid, she began, her voice steady despite the tears. That was a lie I told to make my story more acceptable. They were murdered by white men, outlaws who thought a small ranch in Colorado would be easy pickings. Thomas leaned forward, his expression showing pain for her suffering rather than anger at her deception. I was 19, Margaret continued. I had been visiting friends in Denver when it happened. When I came home, she closed her eyes briefly. The house was burned, and my parents were dead. The neighbors told me what they could, but the killers were long gone. Margaret, Thomas said softly, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Her voice was firm. You married me thinking I was a helpless woman seeking protection. You deserve to know what you actually got. She took a shaky breath before continuing. I should have gone to the law, should have accepted that justice might never come. But I was young and angry and heartbroken. I decided to track them down myself. Thomas's eyes widened. You went after them? Alone? Not entirely alone. I met a man named Samuel Crow, an aging gunfighter who had known my father. When he heard what I was planning, he said if I was determined to get myself killed, I might as well learn how to take a few of them with me. Margaret's hand moved unconsciously to her right hip, where the gun had rested for so many dangerous months. Sam taught me everything, how to draw fast, how to shoot straight, how to track men across country, how to stay alive when people want you dead. He said I had natural talent, steady hands, good eyes. I wish he'd been wrong. How long? Thomas asked. How long were you hunting them? 3 years. The admission hung between them like a confession. 3 years of following cold trails, asking questions in rough towns, learning to sleep with one eye open. My limp, that happened during a gunfight in a place called Devil's Creek. One of them got lucky, put a bullet through my left leg. The bone healed wrong, and there wasn't money for proper medical care. Thomas stared at her, trying to reconcile this story with the gentle woman who had served him breakfast that morning. Did you find them, the men who killed your parents? Margaret's smile was sharp and cold. I found them. All 4 of them eventually. And I made sure they faced justice. My justice. The implication was clear, and Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. You killed them. Yes. There was no remorse in her voice, no regret. I killed them all, and I would do it again. A knock at the door interrupted the heavy conversation. Thomas opened it to find Sheriff Morrison standing on their porch, his hat in his hands and his expression serious. Mr. and Mrs. McKenna, I'm sorry to disturb you, but I need to ask some questions about what happened today. Of course, Sheriff, Thomas said, stepping aside. Please come in. Morrison entered the parlor, his eyes immediately going to the gun on the table. Mrs. McKenna, I've been a lawman for 15 years, and I've never seen shooting like that. You drew and fired 2 precise shots faster than most men could manage one. That kind of skill doesn't come from target practice." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "No, Sheriff, it doesn't. The man we captured, Billy Voss, he's been talking. Says he's never seen anyone outdraw Garrett before. Garrett was fast, had a reputation, killed 12 men in fair fights over the past 5 years. 13, Margaret corrected quietly. Morrison nodded slowly. "I did some checking after the shooting. Sent some telegrams to law enforcement offices around Colorado and Wyoming. Interesting responses I got back." Margaret's jaw tightened slightly. She had known this moment would come eventually. "Seems there's been stories floating around for years about a woman gunfighter," Morrison continued. "Someone who tracked down the Miller gang single-handed. Someone who outdrew Jake Hardin in Deadwood. Someone called the Angel of Death by folks who crossed her." Thomas looked between his wife and the sheriff, his face pale. "The Angel of Death? Just stories," Morrison said carefully. "Legends, mostly. Nobody really believed a woman could do the things this person supposedly did. But the descriptions match, especially the limp." Margaret stood up slowly, her chin raised with quiet dignity. "What exactly are you asking me, Sheriff?" "I'm asking if you're the woman those stories are about. And I'm asking what you plan to do now that half the territory will know there's a famous gunfighter living in Silverbrook." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "Those stories you heard, they're about someone I used to be, someone I had to become to survive and to see justice done, but that part of my life is over. It ended the day I answered Thomas's letter seeking a wife." "Is it?" Morrison pressed. "Because word of today's shooting is going to spread. There are men out there who've heard those legends, men who might come looking for the Angel of Death to test their own skills." The sheriff's words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had hoped that settling down in a quiet frontier town would allow her to disappear, to become just another ranch wife with an unfortunate limp. But she realized now how naive that hope had been. "What are you saying?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with concern. "I'm saying that reputation has a way of following a person," Morrison replied. "There are young guns out there who travel 1,000 miles for the chance to outdraw a legend, and there are old enemies who might see this as an opportunity for revenge." Margaret sank back into her chair, the weight of years suddenly pressing down on her. "I thought it was over," she whispered. "I thought I could finally have a normal life." Thomas moved to her side, taking her hand despite the revelations of the past hour. "We'll face whatever comes together," he said firmly. "You're my wife, and that's what matters." "But look what I've brought to your doorstep," Margaret said, tears flowing freely now. "Violence, danger, a reputation that could destroy the peaceful life you've built here." "You brought courage and strength," Thomas replied. "Today you saved lives, including the sheriff's. Whatever else you've done, whatever you've had to become, you used your skills to protect innocent people." Morrison cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. McKenna, I need to ask, are there people out there with a particular grudge against you? Anyone who might pose a specific threat to this town?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "The men who killed my parents are all dead. Most of the others I faced were just young fools looking for a reputation. But there might be complications." "What kind of complications?" "Family members seeking revenge, associates of men I've killed. And you're right about young gunfighters. There are always men looking to make their name by outdrawing someone famous." Morrison nodded grimly. "Then we need to be prepared. I can wire the territorial authorities, request additional deputies if needed." "No," Margaret said firmly. "I won't have this town turned into an armed camp because of my past. If trouble comes looking for me, I'll face it. But I won't let innocent people suffer for choices I made years ago." "You won't face it alone," Thomas said, with quiet determination. "I may not be a gunfighter, but I can handle a rifle. And I won't let anyone hurt my wife." As the sun began to set over Silverbrook, casting long shadows across the prairie, the three of them sat in the McKenna parlor, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, life in the small frontier town was returning to normal, But inside this house, everything had changed forever. Margaret Rose O'Sullivan McKenna was no longer the pitied bride who limped down Main Street while townspeople whispered about her limitations. She was revealed now as something far more complex, a woman who had faced unimaginable loss, survived through violence and determination, and found the courage to start over in a place where no one knew her history. But as Sheriff Morrison had warned, the past had a way of catching up with people, especially those who had lived by the gun. And somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of the American frontier, there might already be men packing their saddlebags and checking their weapons, preparing to ride toward a small town called Silverbrook to test themselves against the legend of the Angel of Death. The townspeople who had laughed at the limping bride would never see her the same way again. They now knew that the woman they had dismissed as weak and helpless was, in fact, probably the most dangerous person within 100 miles. And as word of the gunfight spread beyond Silverbrook's borders, carried by traveling merchants and telegraph wires, Margaret could only hope that the peaceful life she had tried to build would survive the storm that was surely coming. For now, though, she had Thomas beside her, Sheriff Morrison's respect and protection, and the knowledge that when the moment came, she had chosen to use her deadly skills to protect innocent people rather than for personal gain. It wasn't the redemption she had hoped for, but perhaps it was the redemption she deserved. The Angel of Death was supposed to be a legend, a ghost story told in saloons and around campfires. But legends, Margaret had learned, were just truths that people preferred to keep at a distance. And now that distance had collapsed, bringing truth and legend together in a small frontier town where a woman with a limp had proven that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones the world needs most.